to this video lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of Plato's Apology, and specifically we're going to finish up our discussion of how Socrates defends himself against what he calls the old accusations that he brings up at trial. And let's remember, these accusations were not the official ones he was facing, but they sort of were a reputation he had built up in the city of Athens, and it comprised two components. One, that he was a natural philosopher, and two, that he was a sophist. Now, as we saw, he actually denies both charges. He says he's just not interested in natural philosophy. And as we saw in our previous video, he actually is quite a strenuous critic of sophistry, sees it as completely opposed to philosophy. And this is a theme you can see throughout many of Plato's dialogues, that there's something fundamentally wrong with sophistry, to the point that it's actually bad for the human soul and makes you worse off insofar as you're not pursuing the truth. Of course, from the jury's perspective, if this is in fact the case, if Socrates is neither of those things, he's not a natural philosopher, nor is he a sophist, we might want an explanation, well, where did this reputation come from then? And we see Socrates posing these questions. Someone might say, Socrates, what then is your occupation? What has given rise to these slanders against you? Surely if you weren't in fact occupied with something out of the ordinary, if you weren't doing something different from most people, all this rumor and talk wouldn't have arisen. Now, to some extent, one explanation that Socrates gives for this is the fact that, again, as we've discussed, he had a habit of going around Athens in the agora or the marketplace, engaging in philosophical questioning with a lot of young people around him who liked to hear what he said. And so in some sense he looked like a sophist, and he acknowledges this. He says, "You see, I do nothing else except go around trying to persuade you, both young and old alike, not to care about your bodies or your money as intensely as about how your soul may be in the best possible condition." So he goes around telling people that those pursuits, those objects, those goals that people have in their life that are most common in the city, right? How to attain wealth, how to ensure that their body is in the best possible condition, how to gain influence in the city, that those things don't matter. And that the only true things that truly matter is care for your soul, pursuit of truth, justice, and goodness. Now, this alone would make him stand out as a very sort of strange figure in Athens. And also the topics in which he was speaking about the nature of virtue are at least the topics that the sophists themselves claim to talk about. Now, although Socrates thinks they talk about it entirely the wrong way, not oriented toward truth, just trying to say things that sound good, they were still talking about virtue a lot. So from an outside perspective, Socrates may very well have looked like a sophist. Secondly, he admits that the sons of the very rich enjoy listening to people being cross-examined. They often imitate me themselves and in turn attempt to cross-examine others. So again, he had very, very many wealthy young people around him, as a sophist would, and you could see how this would be a little annoying if those young people who followed him around Athens and were his followers then went to imitate them and questioning other people themselves. Because now not only do they have to deal with Socrates forcing them to examine their philosophical beliefs, but also this whole train of followers that he has. So as two commentators, Brickhouse and Smith, explain, it's not difficult to imagine that the typical Athenian viewed with deep mistrust the spectacle of Socrates arguing about excellence surrounded by young men of the wealthy class. So that's part of it. That's in part where this reputation came from. But Socrates also offers another explanation. He says that the reason he has this reputation is because of a certain sort of wisdom that he has. And in this passage where he explains this, he separates two different kinds of wisdom, what he calls human wisdom and what he calls superhuman wisdom. And let's look at superhuman wisdom first. And what he says about this is that this is a kind of knowledge he does not possess. Or wisdom he does not possess. Now, to be clear, it's the sort of wisdom he would most like to have. Why is that? Well, he describes superhuman wisdom as knowledge of the most important things, knowledge of how your soul might be in the best possible condition. In other words, superhuman wisdom would entail you know how to live an excellent and flourishing human life. This is the question that Socrates thinks is most important above all, but it's also the question which he thinks he does not fully have an answer to, and he fully admits this to the jury. Now, he also suggests in this passage that, I'm not like a sophist, I don't have such knowledge. Again, we should see him as being sarcastic. He doesn't really think the sophists have this sort of wisdom or knowledge. And one other thing that we should think about here is, notice that what he's talking about here is a sort of wisdom he says he has. Right? And he doesn't specifically talk about knowledge. And that might bring up the question, what actually is the difference between wisdom and knowledge? Why is it wisdom that Socrates is concerned with? What's the difference between these? Well, if we think about knowledge, one can be said to know many things. Even people who are immature and of a very young age. So a middle schooler might have done a great job in his or her biology exam and know many things about biology or math, right? A teenager might be an expert auto mechanic, might have knowledge of some specific practice or activity or craft. But a very young person who doesn't have much experience in the world, even if they were a genius in art or a savant in music or excellent in sports, even if they had very technical and specialized knowledge in those fields, it's unlikely we would say someone who is young and doesn't have much life experience that they are wise, that they have wisdom, even if they know many things. And in part, this is because wisdom entails not just knowledge of certain technical matters, but how to apply that to your life. How to exercise good judgment. How to know what things are truly important in life and how to use the knowledge that you have to pursue those things. And I think this is why, for Socrates, what's at issue here is wisdom. Because again, what he's really concerned with is not just knowledge for its own sake, but how to use the knowledge we have to live an excellent human life, or as he would put it, to ensure that our soul is in the best possible condition. So when he denies that he has this sort of superhuman wisdom, he's saying, I have been seeking this sort of wisdom my entire life, but I still am lacking in terms of knowledge of what's most important and how to live the best possible flourishing life I can as a human being. And part of, as we'll see later on in the Apology, essentially what he sees as his philosophical mission is to keep pursuing that knowledge, keep pursuing that sort of wisdom. But there is a sort of wisdom that Socrates claims he does have, and he calls this human wisdom. And in order to explain to the jury what this human wisdom is, which he admits is of much lower value, but it's still something that he thinks he possesses, he tells a story. So he says here, please don't create an uproar, men of Athens, even if you think I'm somehow making grand claims. You see, I'm not the author of the story I'm about to tell, though I'll refer you to a reliable source. In fact, as a witness to the existence of my wisdom, if indeed it is a sort of wisdom, and to its nature, I'll present the god at Delphi to you. So what is this god at Delphi? Well, to get at this, he tells a story of when his friend Chaerephon visited this god, or this oracle at Delphi. So the oracle at Delphi, in ancient Greece, was this sort of oracle you could consult that was supposed to speak for the god Apollo, and I have a picture of it here. Now, the basic idea is that you went to the oracle, you had some sort of question, and you would ask a question of the oracle, and you would not get a straightforward answer back. It would usually be given to you in a form of a riddle or something you had to puzzle out. The answer was never straightforward. And, of course, according to legend, the oracle was speaking for the god Apollo. Now, in historical terms, what was occurring here? Well, one historian says that when you went into the inner temple and were finally confronted by the oracle and had the opportunity to ask her a question, there the priestess resided and gave her pronouncements, possibly in a drug or natural gas-induced state of ecstasy. So there's some speculation about what was really doing the work of channeling the god Apollo, but in any case, the legend has it that you went to the god Apollo, you went to the oracle, and you asked a question and gave a sort of riddle-like answer. So let's look at the story that Socrates tells about when his friend Chaerephon went to visit the oracle. He tells the jury, you remember Chaerephon, no doubt. He was a friend of mine from youth and also a friend of your party. who shared your recent exile and restoration. So he was one of the people who left Athens when the 30 took over and then came back. You remember then what sort of man Chaerephon was, how intense he was in whatever he set out to do. Well, on one occasion in particular, he went to Delphi and dared to ask the oracle. He asked, exactly as I'm telling you, whether anyone was wiser than myself. So Chaerephon went to the oracle. He asked, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? The Pythia drew forth the response that no one is wiser. Okay, so Chaerephon asked the oracle, is anyone wiser than Socrates? Chaerephon says no. Now, that Socrates is the wisest person. Now, again, we shouldn't entirely take this answer at face value, right? It's not intended to be a straightforward answer, right? Even if we suppose it's true that Socrates is in fact the wisest person, the message that the oracle is trying to get across has some deeper layer. There's some roundabout way that the oracle is trying to make this point. And so, because that's the case, first of all, Socrates says, wait a minute, this can't be right. It can't just be that I'm the wisest person. The reason he thinks this is because he denies having superhuman wisdom. So Socrates says, when he hears Chaerephon tell him this, what can the god be saying? What does his riddle mean? For I'm only too aware that I have no claim to being wise in anything either great or small. What can he mean then by saying I'm the wisest? Now, it's interesting here because you can imagine, like, if someone came to you and said, on the authority of the god Apollo, I found out you were the wisest, you might just say, wow, I really am a wise individual. I'm the wisest person who's ever lived. I really am something grand, excellent, and great. I think it's interesting that Socrates' first reaction is to, in a certain sense, remain humble and say, wait a minute, no, there's something deeper I'm supposed to discover here. Because I know that I haven't attained superhuman wisdom. I know that, unfortunately, I'm not wise in anything either great or small. So there must be some underlying meaning here, and Socrates intends to discover what exactly is that meaning. What is it that the oracle wants him to discover? So what does he do? Well, Socrates says, look, if the oracle is saying I'm the wisest individual, then what I should do is probably try to go around and see if I can prove this claim false. Right, so he says, I approached one of the people thought to be wise, assuming that in his company, if anywhere, I could refute the pronouncement and say to the oracle, here's someone wiser than I, yet you said I was the wisest. So Socrates says, look, if I just find one person that is wiser than me, then I can show that the oracle is false. The oracle statement is false. So Socrates claims he's going to question anyone with a reputation for knowledge. And he goes around Athens and he says he questioned three groups of individuals. There were the politicians, the poets, and the craftsmen, right? So the politicians have a reputation for knowledge because they're the people who have gained power and influence in the city. People voted for them. So ostensibly they must think there's some sort of wisdom or knowledge the politicians have. The poets, because they're seen as experts in the ability to create beautiful works of art. And the craftsmen, and what this just means is anyone with sort of a technical skill, whether like a blacksmith or a shoemaker or a baker, right? Just anyone with sort of technical skill. So you say, well, craftsmen have a reputation for knowledge because they certainly know how to do that practical thing. And so he goes around to each of these three groups and says, can I find someone wiser in any of these three groups? And we'll start off by looking at his examination of the politicians. So he says, then I examined this person. There's no need for me to mention him by name. He was one of our politicians. Now, why did Socrates say here there's no need to mention him by name? Likely because this person was probably in the jury that he was talking to, and it's very likely that many people knew who this person was. And when I examined him and talked with him, men of Athens, my experience was something like this. I thought this man seemed wise to many people, and especially to himself, but wasn't. So you can imagine what happened here, right? Socrates confronts this individual. He engages in the same sort of philosophical dialogue we saw with Euthyphro. I'm not saying about the same topic, but just in general, that sort of question and answer Socratic dialogue where he takes the idea you have and sort of takes it apart. so he continues, then I tried to show him that he thought himself wise but wasn't. As a result, he came to dislike me. And so did many of the people present. Okay, so I want to pause there for a moment and think about this. You have to imagine that this not necessarily being a private conversation, right? So Socrates did these dialogues in the marketplace, in public. And so he goes to this politician, someone who has attained power in the city, who's very well known, and we'll imagine Socrates just taking him apart in argument. Now, one thing we might think about is, what should we think about Socrates' action here? On the one hand, you could argue that Socrates has unfairly humiliated someone. Right? You could say, well, look, why did you do that in public? Other people were around. Why did you have to sort of display or uncover this person's ignorance in that way that embarrasses them? And especially if you think about the culture of ancient Greece and Athens, you know, it was very much a sort of culture of pride, right? So and to a certain extent, our culture still is today, right? And every single culture is, but it was very much focused on, right, how you appear to others, taking pride in your reputation, again, being able to wield influence through gaining favor in the Athenian democracy. So when Socrates goes to this well-known politician, takes him apart in an argument, and seems to downgrade his status, we can imagine this being a very humiliating experience. And so it's not all that surprising that the politician came to dislike him. And you might say, well, that's not very kind. Why did Socrates have to do that? On the other hand, you might say, well, is Socrates really responsible for the humiliation of this politician? Right? Is it really Socrates' fault that this politician was going around pretending he was very wise, pretending he knew many things, which in fact he didn't know? In fact, you might shift the blame and say, no, it's not Socrates' fault for humiliating the politician. Maybe the problem is that the politician doesn't have enough intellectual humility. The politician is not able to admit to the things he doesn't actually know, and has a sort of sense of himself, or he has a sort of idea of himself in his mind, which is way out of touch with reality. And what's interesting about that idea, I think that's how Socrates sees what he's doing. He's forcing people to confront their own ignorance and admit what they don't know. And it's just the inability of this politician to do that which led Socrates to believe that he was wiser than the politician. So let's continue on. So after this exchange, Socrates says, for my part, I thought to myself as I left, I'm wiser than that person. For it's likely that neither of us knows anything fine and good. Remember, Socrates says, I don't know anything all that great. And this politician doesn't either, because I just took him apart in argument. But he thinks he knows something he doesn't know. Whereas I, since I don't in fact know, don't think that I do either. At any rate, it seems I'm wiser than he in just this one small way, that what I don't know, I don't think I know. So, this ultimately is what Socrates understands his wisdom to be. He says, neither I nor this politician know anything, but I am willing to admit what I don't know. I'm not deceiving myself into thinking that I know something that I don't actually know. And in fact, this politician and the other people he questions, he thinks are engaging in self-deception. They're making themselves believe that they have wisdom or knowledge over many subjects that they don't actually have wisdom or knowledge over. Now, we should pause for a second on this idea of self-deception, because it's a very strange sort of idea. Because first of all, how can you deceive yourself? How can you make yourself believe something that's not true? In order to deceive someone, you need to know that a certain thing is not true, and then cause the other person to believe it. But how could you do that with yourself? Because to deceive yourself, you'd have to know the thing you're deceiving about is actually not true. But if you know it's not true, how could you be deceived? It's a very strange, self-deception is a very strange phenomenon. Yet I would submit to you it's actually somewhat common. We deceive ourselves about many things. And if you think about it, anytime you've sort of gotten yourself to believe something that you know isn't true, and often this happens when you're acting in a way, that you know you shouldn't act, right? So let's say you're trying to, you're trying to start a diet and get healthy. You're trying to change your lifestyle to improve your health. And you start off going pretty well, but then you start making some exceptions. You start saying, well, just a little bit here, I'll have some sweets, or I'll start skipping some workouts here, right? You start going back against the principles you set at first. Now, it becomes easier to do that over time, but you still might have a sort of sense in the back of your mind to say, wait, this is not what I'm supposed to be doing. This is not good for me. Now, how might you get around that? Well, sometimes we talk ourselves into the fact that, if I just sort of slip up a few times, or if I take a week off and then the next week off, it'll be fine. It's not going to affect me. You deny the fact that you're slipping back into your old ways. And if you repeat it enough, if you sort of constantly hold on to this idea that what you're doing is not bad, and you constantly repeat it to yourself, you can become committed to something that on some level you know is false. So, this is what Socrates is claiming here. He's claiming that the politicians that he talked to are in some sense, right, they're in some sense engaged in this behavior. And it's not hard to see why that would be the case, right? To be someone of a high status and power and influence in a community, you have a lot of responsibility, and you might have lingering doubts about whether you can live up to that responsibility, or you might have lingering doubts about whether you're really able to take on the tasks you need to do. And to some extent, you might be right. Maybe you really aren't up to the task. So how do you keep going on? You might, in fact, need to engage in some form of self-deception to sort of build up your own self-esteem, build up your own sense of yourself, so that you can continue taking on these very difficult and challenging tasks. And we'll come back to this point because it really touches on whether self-deception is a good or bad thing. So in any case, what we can say at the moment is that Socrates sees his sort of wisdom as the fact that he can own up to what he doesn't know, and he sees the ignorance of the politicians he questioned as not being able to own up to that, being self-deceived. So, I'll just briefly touch on this. The next two groups, the poets and the craftsmen, he also questions, and he finds a similar sort of thing going on. He says with the poets, they actually were able to do many fine things. They were able to compose great poems that Socrates admits he couldn't. But whenever he questioned them about the poems, he found that they didn't really understand the meaning of what they wrote. And why was that? Because the way they wrote it came through some sort of natural inspiration. And we find this in many sort of intensely creative people. The way they create their art, whether it's a painting or a poem or a song, does come through some sort of inspiration, perhaps a drug-induced inspiration. And in those instances, it's likely that the individual in question can't totally explain where these ideas come from. They don't fully understand them. And what Socrates notes about this is first of all, we can't say the poets are knowledgeable or wise about their poems if they don't really understand them. But more importantly, Socrates notes that because of their poetry, they thought themselves to be the wisest of people about other things as well. So it was their expertise in poetry which caused them to think that they knew maybe about moral matters, religious matters, political matters, which had nothing to do with the poetry that they didn't understand in the first place. So again, he found the poets were unable to sort of live up to the reputation for knowledge that they thought they had. They were also engaged in a form of self-deception. The same with the craftsmen. Socrates notes, look, the craftsmen could make things and knew things about technical pieces of knowledge that I had no idea about. But again, because of that technical knowledge, the craftsmen thought they knew about a whole other host of topics. So just like the poets, they were also engaged in a sort of self-deception, not owning up to their own ignorance, And Socrates finds that he's wiser than them in at least this one respect, that at least he owns up to his ignorance. So ultimately, here's what Socrates concludes from these exchanges. So he says, look, the oracle was correct. The oracle was in fact correct, that there is a sense in which I am wiser than everyone else, only because I admit to my own ignorance. And the important question which he also poses, he asks himself this question. So I ask myself on behalf of the oracle whether I prefer to be as I am, not in any way wise with their wisdom, nor ignorant with their ignorance, or to have both qualities as they did, right? Would I rather not know anything but admit it, or not know anything and think I know a bunch of things? And Socrates says, the answer I gave to myself and to the oracle was that it profited me more to be just the way I was. And we should really think about that carefully, right? Here's the comparison we're considering. So we have the politicians, also the poets and craftsmen, who are in a situation where they don't know anything fine or good, but they do have deceived themselves to thinking they know it. On the other hand, we have Socrates, who doesn't know anything fine and good, but also hasn't deceived himself. He admits what he doesn't know. And the common standard response in any introduction to philosophy class is to look at this situation, and because Socrates is the sort of absolute paragon, he's the exemplar of philosophy, we're supposed to think, well, of course, it's better to admit when we don't know the truth, it's better to be guided by the truth, it's better not to deceive ourselves. But one thing I invite you to think about is whether that's actually always the case. Are there any situations in which self-deception might be helpful? It might be necessary. Now, to some extent, I've already suggested one, right? And you see this oftentimes with very high-level athletes. So if you're a high-level athlete going against some of the best athletes in competition in the entire world, well, it takes a great deal of confidence to convince yourself that you're up to the task of competing with them. And it may very well be the case that your skills are not up to the task. It might be the case that those other people you're competing against are in some sense better than you are. So how do you gain the confidence and courage to go out there and engage in the competition anyway? It's very rare that you see a high-level excellent athlete be self-deprecating and extremely humble about their talents and abilities. There are, of course, exceptions. But oftentimes you see many athletes sort of almost on the, sometimes bragging, sometimes on the border of bragging about how excellent they are, how hard they worked, how great their talent is, and how they're absolutely going to destroy the competition. Right? Many examples of this would come to mind. And we might wonder whether in some cases a sort of self-deception is actually necessary in order to accomplish the task we want in life. Is it always better to live in a world of truth? Or sometimes do we need to create helpful illusions? Helpful illusions that give us the confidence to do what we need to do. So that's on one side. You might say Socrates is wrong. In fact, there are benefits to self-deception. On the other hand, we should also think about the downsides. And one way to think about this is, what is the harm of deceiving another person? Right? So, let's say, for instance, that you deceive another person. You convince them that you want to be their friend, but in fact, you don't want to be, that's not what you want to get out of this relationship. What you want to get out of this relationship is you just want to copy their homework. Okay, so you're deceiving this person about your intentions. Now, suppose that person never finds out about this. Suppose they let you copy their homework because they have other sort of moral deficiencies, but they do it because they think you're their friend. Okay, so the question is, have you harmed that individual? Now, in a certain sense, you might say no, because from their point of view, they just think you're their friend, and they think you get along great, and they don't no idea that they're being used and manipulated. But on the other hand, you might say, well, to force someone to live in a false reality, to manipulate them, to treat them like an object you're just using for your personal gain, just seems fundamentally wrong. Even if they don't know it, it just seems wrong to use people for your purposes in just that way. And one thing I would invite you to think about is, isn't self-deception the same thing? If you deceive yourself into thinking that you know things you don't, or thinking you can do things you can't do, if you convince yourself of things that you know to be false, aren't you manipulating or using yourself in the same way? And if it's wrong to use or manipulate others, why is it okay to use and manipulate yourself? In any case, I think these are important questions we should continue to pursue in our discussion when we think about the nature of self-deception. So, finally, we get this sort of characterization of what human wisdom is. Right, so we see that ultimately what Socrates' wisdom is, this human wisdom, is just the fact that he's willing, he has the ability to admit to his own ignorance. And remember, we're going to call this Socratic wisdom. And remember in our previous lesson when we talked about how one of Socrates' main critiques of sophistry is that it doesn't orient us toward the truth. And from his point of view, the main benefit of philosophy is that it cures our ignorance. Ignorance is a disease of the soul. And to the extent that we live in ignorance, our soul is damaged, our character is damaged, who we are as a person is damaged. So given that, it makes total sense that Socrates would see this as his form of wisdom. Because even though he would love to know the things that are entailed by superhuman wisdom, if he can at least admit to his own ignorance, if he can cure himself of his pretensions to know things he doesn't know, he at least won't live in untruth. He won't live in ignorance. And he won't have that disease of the soul that he thinks philosophy is intended to cure. Okay, so I will stop there. As always, I hope this video was enjoyable and helpful, and I will see you in the next video.